Welcome back to the fourth video in Lecture 5 of Covidenomics. In the previous videos in this fifth lecture, we've been looking at the alternative strategies for government, and we found that quite often the hard lockdown, particularly early on, makes sense because it gives flexibility to the government. Now, the objective of the hard lockdown is to keep the reproduction number less than 1. But there's a whole range of actions that might be able to achieve that. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to ask, well, which actions should the government be thinking about? Secondly, how does it then design those actions? Because there's different ways that can be done. Thirdly, does it actually depend on which country you're in? So does the choice of strategy and the choice of actions differ between countries? And finally, we're going to just briefly look at the role of chance in here. Eric Budish from the University of Chicago reminds us that once we've decided, yep, we want to do that hard lockdown, we want to aim to get the reproduction number, or beta, less than 1, we can really set that up as a standard economic problem. So what we're really trying to do is work out how to maximise social welfare given various technological constraints associated with the virus, given incentive constraints, given that we just can't force people at gunpoint to do certain things. We've got to make sure that we give them the incentives to do the right things, and subject to making sure we achieve our objective, which is to get this beta less than 1, or a reproduction rate less than 1. And that when we're thinking about the set of actions, we want the least cost actions, or the best actions, that means we're going to maximise social welfare, to achieve this objective. So what are those actions going to look like? Budish notes that we could achieve this objective in a range of different ways, that there are a whole range of different actions that we could do as a society. We could shut all businesses, or we could shut some businesses. We could require all people to stay at home, or we could require certain groups of people to stay at home, and so on. And that we're actually thinking about trade-offs here. If we're more relaxed in one dimension with regards to the virus, then we need to be stricter in other dimensions. So what are the best set of actions in a hard lockdown to get that beta less than 1? Budish suggests some potential candidates. Let's have a look at them. The first candidate that Budish suggests is wearing a mask. The evidence was pretty clear pretty early on that wearing a mask, particularly when you're interacting with other people, and particularly in enclosed indoor spaces, is a pretty good idea to reduce the spread of a virus like coronavirus. There are various reasons why that was played down in some Western countries. There was a fear that there would be a shortage of masks and that health workers wouldn't be able to get them if everyone started wearing a mask. But it is interesting to know that the Asian countries which had previous experience with pandemics and have been very successful at locking down the virus and reducing the transmission, almost all of those countries had pretty close to uniform or universal mask wearing right from day one. Budish's second candidate is simply wearing gloves. Again, when you're out, when you're in, say, a retail environment, or you're in a bar, in a club, wherever, make sure you don't pick up the virus from hard surfaces. A third action that Budish suggests is simple: staying at home when you're sick. So if you get symptoms, stay at home. Now, that was pushed pretty much everywhere. However, there is a barrier to staying at home if you're in insecure work, you don't get paid a lot of money, and you don't have any sick leave. So it's not enough just to say, stay at home if you're not feeling well. But as we've learnt through the course of this pandemic, the government needs to go a bit further and say, stay at home when you're sick or not feeling well, and by the way, we will compensate you for loss of income or for that lack of sick leave, and so on. Budish's fourth action, well, that's in line with the World Health Organization, which very early on said test, test, test. The fourth action is make sure you're carrying out those tests, making sure that you understand what is happening with virus transmission. The fifth one, and this is one that Australia adopted very early on, social distancing. Just try and make sure that people keep a distance from each other. If you're interacting with people outside your household in Australia, the rule is keep 1.5 metres apart. And Budish's final simple action relates to quarantine. Both people who are found to test positive for COVID-19, they should self-isolate in their homes, and people coming back from overseas where there's a higher level of COVID-19, they should also isolate. They should be quarantined to avoid the potential for the spread of the virus. Now, these are a pretty good set of candidates for low-cost, effective actions to try and reduce the spread of COVID-19. They're not the only ones you could think of. For example, we might want to have a policy where certain businesses are closed, businesses that involve a high degree of social interaction and increase the chance of the spread of the virus. And we may not need all of these actions, we may only need some of them. Budish really isn't saying that these are the actions that we need to do. What he's really saying is that we need to familiarise ourselves with the options for these actions and then choose a set or a group of actions that are going to work at least cost. And he's really doing a plea for research into this area. It's not clear that governments really have done this. A lot of the changes in policies, both when tightening up lockdown and when reducing lockdown, seem to be pretty ad hoc. And it's not clear that there's much research or much thought about the alternatives driving that behaviour. Once we've got our set of actions, how do we actually design them? Well, Bob Sloanham, together with his colleagues Patrick Hendy and Francisca Tausch from the University of Sydney, have thought about how best to design the actions using insights from behavioural economics. If people feel that they've become obligated to a course of behaviour, that they've committed themselves publicly to that course of behaviour, then they're more likely to follow it through. So the first of the suggestions about design is to help people reflect on their moral costs, the moral obligation. A simple way, when people come back into Australia and they need to self-isolate, signing a declaration form saying that they've understood the requirements, they've understood the rules, and they agree that they will self-isolate for the 14 days. That can help increase the level of compliance. It's not perfect, but it can help. A bit like with the first design element, the second one says that we want to make the moral reason for the rule clear and remind people of the moral reason. Remind them of why they're doing it, what the underlying rationale behind the rule is. For example, not putting their fellow citizens at risk. The third one is to make the victim salient. What that means is make sure that people understand that if they don't follow the required action, then somebody particular is going to be damaged. So not just a vague people will be hurt, but for example, older Australians, your auntie, your uncle, your own parents, your grandparents, they're the ones likely to die. Or the health workers, if you violate the rules, if you don't follow these actions, what you're doing is you're making the risks high for our health workers, for the nurses, the doctors who are dedicated to saving lives. Reframing the action in those terms will help increase compliance. Fourthly, clear rules are more likely to be complied with than vague rules. The second lockdown in Melbourne has highlighted this issue of clarity of rules. We've had some very clear rules, such as if you go outside, you must wear a mask. Outside your own house, wear a mask, full stop. Very clear, very simple, very high degree of compliance with that rule. However, some other rules, particularly around movements, who can move around, when you can move around and so on, have been much vaguer. And when questioned about it, the Premier has tended to respond, well, if you need to think about it, then you're probably violating the rule. That provides a lot of wriggle room, and I wouldn't be surprised if the numbers after this is all over show that there was a lot more people pushing the boundaries with some of those movement rules. And the final one is that leaders need to show compliance. If the average person on the street notices that their leaders, their politicians, their business leaders, their sports leaders and so on aren't obeying the rules, they're probably not going to obey the rules themselves. If those leaders in society are complying, the chances of everyone else complying goes up. So the clear lesson here is it's not good enough just to say these are the relevant actions. We need to think about how to design those actions using the insights from behavioural economics and psychology to work out how best to design the actions to get the highest level of compliance. Thirdly, how does the choice of the strategies or the actions depend on the country that you happen to be in? Here's a couple of different locations that provide very stark illustrations of the different challenges facing different countries. So, over on my right here, this is New Zealand. New Zealand has eliminated the virus. New Zealand is an island a long way from anywhere except Australia, pretty much. So it was relatively easy to isolate and then to have a short, sharp, very hard lockdown, and they were successful eliminating the virus. And they've kept their borders shut pretty much to people movement since then. Good quarantine to make sure that the virus doesn't start off again. So they had options available to them because small island nation. In some ways Australia also had options because it was geographically a bit of a larger island nation. But being an island helps. Up the top here we have Dharavi. Used to be at least the largest slum in Asia. It's located in Mumbai in India, near the airport in Santa Cruz East. It is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. There will be families living in each of these little dwellings here, connected by very small alleyways. The idea of social distancing is pretty much impossible. Trying to lock down Dharavi is pretty much impossible because the people who live there are the poorest workers in Mumbai and they have no savings. If they don't go to work, they don't get money for their family and their family starves. So the challenge of locking down or constraining the virus in Dharavi is very, very different from the challenge of, say, locking down Melbourne or locking down Sydney and imposing social distancing. Now, New Zealand and Dharavi are pretty much at the opposite ends of the spectrum, but there's differences between Western countries that matter as well. So, for example, we've mentioned Sweden a couple of times because Sweden did the soft lockdown, let it run type of approach, and it's been criticised for it in some areas. But it is sort of important to recognise that Sweden isn't the same as, say, Italy and isn't the same as Australia. It has different customs, it has different cultures. A simple fact, around 50% of households in Sweden involve a single person. That's about twice the level that you see in, for example, Australia. So if you're starting to say, well, look, just socially isolate, stay at home when you can, don't spread the virus around, it's going to be a lot easier when you have 50% single-person households than if you have much fewer than that, and particularly if you've got a lot of multi-generation family households where the children are at school, mum and dad are off at work, and the grandparents might also be living in the same dwelling. So those differences between countries change the options that are available for government when they're choosing the actions to try to eliminate the virus or to implement a hard lockdown. Finally, there is simply the role of chance. Here is a map of Australia as of June. pretty much the same when I'm making this in early August. It shows that New South Wales and Victoria and the ACT have their borders open, people can come and go. The rest of Australia is shut to movements. And the reason is that there's still coronavirus cases pretty active in Victoria, New South Wales, and there's even some in the ACT. Pretty much every other state, everywhere else in Australia, has eliminated the virus. Now, does that mean that all of these other states did a harder lockdown, they were tougher, and they were successful? No. The lockdown strategies were pretty much the same in every state, in every part of Australia. In fact, they were probably harder in Victoria, at least initially, than they were in Queensland. I've got relatives up there, and listening to them going out and saying how they had just enjoyed a game of golf when all the golf courses were closed in Melbourne. Yeah, you get my drift. So, why were they successful? Well, maybe they did a better job of putting the policies in place, but quite frankly, most of it is probably due to just chance, to random dumb luck. Sometimes things go wrong, sometimes things go right. And that's something that you just can't control. What has this meant for Australia? Well, as I've mentioned before, it's made life sort of a bit difficult. Quite reasonably, the rest of Australia has said to New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT, we don't want your infection. Victoria, New South Wales and the ACT are sitting there saying, we want to come and visit your states. We've got relatives there. Some people live there. But the borders are shut and it's pretty hard to move between those borders. So random luck is pretty much designed where we've ended up to in Australia, at least at this stage. So let's just summarise what we've done in this 5th lecture. So a lot of it, the first 3 videos, were really around this idea of real options. And the idea of real options is very important for government policy. What we're doing is we're saying that when thinking about the alternatives, governments need to consider the real option value of not making irreversible decisions. So for example, for COVID-19, starting with a hard lockdown, as we've seen, gives the government flexibility, enables it to get more information and make better decisions. And we saw that in our little example, even if the chance of coronavirus being a high death rate was as small as, say, 26, 27%, a hard lockdown may still be the best strategy to start with, even if you end up changing to a soft lockdown later. This final video, we've run through the actions that need to be associated with whatever the chosen strategy is. And we've said that governments need to think about the least cost actions, how to then implement those actions, and to recognise that there's no one size fits all. What works in Australia may not work in an Asian country, it may not work in India, for example, it may not work in Europe, in countries where there's lots of movement across borders, and so on. The solution differs around the world in terms of minimising the spread of coronavirus. And finally, we noted that sometimes luck plays its role, and I think that's probably a fair statement about where we've ended up in Australia. Finally, just the 2 references that we used in this video, Slonim, Hindi and Tausch up here. Just Google it. It's on the University of Sydney News and Opinion, just a little one-pager. Eric Budish, he's at the University of Chicago, and he put out his work as part of a working paper back on April 1st of this year. Worth having a look, again, freely obtainable, just Google search it. Thanks for listening. Come back next time with the 6th lecture.